may not know, because it's one of those states in the middle, has a very high population of Scandinavian and German people. So as you might imagine, when you go to Minnesota, there are a lot of sort of tall, sturdy, pale people running around. People who look a lot like me. There was, in my entire school, K through 12, one black family. Now, I was friendly with this family, and my parents talked to me more about the civil rights movement and about racial equality than probably most Midwestern parents at that time. So I thought all along that I had a really, really good handle on the whole race issue. Black, white, whatever, equal, good, we're fine. Well, then I was in college, and the O.J. Simpson trial was happening. And I knew the basic facts about what was going on with this trial, but really, the whole proceeding was a pretty low priority in my life. I wasn't watching the trial, I wasn't really paying attention, didn't care much about the verdict. But the whole thing was being played constantly on the TV in the student center. And there was always this group of students, a large group of students, gathered around the TV in the student center. And one day I was walking by, sort of vaguely wondering what was the big deal that you would sort of gather around and watch some trial happening on TV. You would care enough to do that. And I happened to notice something about that group of students that I hadn't noticed before. Not a single person sitting in front of that TV was white. And it is then that I realized for the first time that there was something about race and how it functioned in this country that I did not understand. See, to me and my white friends, the O.J. Simpson trial was just a trial. It was about this individual. Did he do this thing or did he not? Simple. But what I learned when I started asking questions of those students sitting around the TV that day was that for the group of black students watching that trial together, it was also about the white cop who arrested him, who made a number of racist slurs while doing so, and reduced Simpson to a skin color rather than an individual on trial. It was about whether he would ever have a chance of being acquitted in a court system where black men are rarely given the chance to be innocent until proven guilty. It was far less about the individual case than it was about a whole history of the criminal justice system's mistreatment of black people. Now, at this point, I had probably thought more about racism and racial issues than most other Midwestern white teenagers, but I had been thinking about racism as an individual behavior, as being about how I treat people one-on-one. I treat people well regardless of their color, so I am not a racist, so racism is not a problem for me. This is how race functioned in my life up to that point. And the thing about that is, I can look at race that way because I am white. As part of the group that holds most of the power in this situation, I am able to believe that everything is equal, that opportunity and success and consequence and punishment are entirely about individual personal choices. But I learned that my perspective might be a little different if my personal individual choices and responsibility kept butting up against the color of my skin. Now, this is a predominantly white congregation in case you haven't looked around yourself, so I'm going to talk to a predominantly white congregation. We could talk about disparities in education and employment opportunities, but the statistics on those things have a lot of variable factors. They tend to be seen as a little less reliable. So I'm going to tell you about a couple of numbers from the U.S. Department of Justice in instead. Black men are incarcerated at a rate of 6 times that of white men. Those numbers were the same for women as recently as 2000. They've gotten a little closer. Now black women are only 3 times more likely than white women to be incarcerated. Black people make up 12% of our population in general, but 40% of the prison population. And the majority of research shows that this is not because white people commit less crime, but because they're simply more likely to be acquitted, more likely to be sentenced with alternatives to incarceration, more likely to be given shorter prison sentences, and more likely to be paroled early. Now, if some of these figures startle or distress you, you should also know that a study that came out of Stanford University this summer revealed that telling the white public these facts about the inequalities in incarceration do not do what you might expect. They actually lead to greater support for harsh, punitive, and racially targeted laws. So, given that we are a predominantly white congregation, maybe I shouldn't tell you these things. But I think that they're important for us to know as we look at the current situation of our world, when names like Michael Brown and Eric Garner and Tamir Rice have suddenly come into the collective national parlance. When in cities around the country, protesters are marching in the streets and holding die-ins in public locations to call attention to racial injustice, specifically racial injustice in our criminal justice system. And it would be easy for a lot of us to not pay attention, like I did with the O.J. Simpson trial. It would be easy for us to not be terribly affected by the deaths of these people that we don't know and have very little connection to. It would be easy for us to say that, well, of course, we don't want to demean the police. Many of us know law enforcement officers. We certainly are not trying to say that they, as individuals, are racist. It would be easy to look at this situation and think it's been blown out of proportion. It would be easy for us to say, well, if only he didn't rob a store, or if only he didn't sell illegal cigarettes, or if only he didn't reach in his pocket and pull out something that looked like a gun, if only he wasn't carrying a toy gun. But at some point in the but if only, you might ask yourself, would this ever happen to me? Because I can tell you that if I walked into Stewart's down the street and cleared the shelves and walked out, what are the chances that a police officer is going to show up and shoot me multiple times or put me in a chokehold until I die? That would be considered a travesty, and I don't think that would be debatable. So maybe we're not as equal or as individual as we think. Now, this particular set of circumstances seems to have been the tipping point for a lot of people. Yesterday in New York City, around 50,000 people walked in a march through Manhattan, and this movement doesn't seem to be slowing down. So I wonder, how do we, as members of the human family, as people of faith, and specifically as people who seek to model our lives after Jesus Christ, how do we respond to the tensions that are going on in our world? How do we avoid being sucked in by the polarizing sorts of forces and seek to be a bridge for good? We're in the third Sunday of Advent right now, and during Advent we tend to talk a lot about this idea of waiting in hope. Most of the time we talk about it in this interior life kind of sense, that it's our personal sort of waiting for what we hope for. But in the Bible, and specifically in the readings from today, the sense of waiting in hope is much more collective. It's this tension between the world as it currently exists and the hope for the world that God is shaping, this world of love and peace and justice. And in both of our readings for today, that world, that vision for that world, is a vision of reversals. For Mary and Isaiah, the coming of God means that unjust power structures are overturned, that the oppressed receive good news, that broken hearts are bound up and healed, that captives are liberated, that prisoners are released, that the powerful are laid low and the lonely are raised up, that the hungry are filled. Isaiah and Mary's words to us give us this vision of not the sort of taking away, not the destruction of people who are in privilege, but the leveling of power in our world. This balancing of power and benefit. And they also invite us to participate as God shapes the world in this vision. Now, I want to be clear, because for those of us who are in dominant groups, these words can be off-putting or scary. Being in a group with power and holding power is not inherently a bad thing. Much like in these situations, law enforcement officials are not bad people. Law enforcement is not a bad thing. Those of us who hold power have a responsibility to carefully consider how we use our power. And some of us don't even know if we're in a dominant group. So if you're wondering, am I in a dominant group? One of the clues is language. So I'm going to use a less charged example and say, when we talk about hockey, if you talk about women's hockey, then it's for women. But if you talk about hockey, it's for men. There's a difference in language there, right? And here in the United States, we have Asian Americans and Latino Americans and African Americans, but those of us who are white just get to be American. So, you might be in a dominant group here. Also, you might be in a dominant group if you can reasonably expect that most of your teachers, doctors, judges, elected officials, etc. are of your demographic. You might be in a dominant group. This benefit that we receive based on social factors that we mostly don't control is called privilege. And a whole lot of us in this room have a lot of it. So what is it that we who are so privileged are called to do? While we live in this tension between a broken world and a vision of the world that God has set out for us. Well, I think a good first step is to listen to those who are negatively affected by the system, by the existing power structures. It's very tempting in situations where people start talking about charged, difficult issues like race to sort of jump in and defend ourselves and say, well, I'm not that way. I'm not a racist. But the fact is that what they're saying to you is not about you. It's primarily not about you anyway. It's about the system. It's about this whole system that enforces stereotyping and segregation in order to keep some people in power and some people out. And we might learn a whole different reality if we start listening to the people who experience the underside of that system, in addition to the people who experience benefit from it. Of course, in that process, we might also learn something about ourselves and about how we contribute to unjust systems. So the second step, I think, in our response is humility. It's a funny thing, I'm not very good at it, but following Christ means that we entertain the possibility that our perspective may not be the only correct one and may in fact be outright wrong. We consider the likelihood that we may very well be called to change, that this God of reversals may want to reverse us. And finally, what we can do, especially if we are people who are privileged, is to stand in solidarity with people who are not. We can choose to use our privilege not to collect more power for ourselves, but to give voice to those who are powerless. For some of It might mean, for some of us, developing a relationship, a friendship, with somebody of a different skin color for the first time in our lives. And it means something collectively for us as a congregation, to stand in solidarity with those who are crying out for justice across all races. Today, as we said, we're recognizing Black Lives Matter Sunday. A number of predominantly Black denominations started this, others have joined them in proclaiming that Black lives do indeed matter, and in calling attention to the issues of racial injustice in our society. Now, some of you have already asked, and may later ask me, why did we not say all lives matter? Because we clearly believe that all lives matter. The fact is, the value of white lives is not currently in question. It means something different to specifically in our society say Black lives, which are so often unvalued, matter to us, matter to God. We say specifically because that Black lives matter because at this particular time and place, it is Black parents who live in fear of their sons never coming home. Now, if we ever have the opportunity to bring good news into the world, as Jesus did and as Jesus calls us to do, it seems to me that our opportunity is when we can participate in a little piece of what God is doing. When we can stand with those who feel isolated. When we can comfort those who are hurting. When we can help to give voice to those who are crying out for justice. The fact is that we are all waiting for a better world. And it's better